New Florida Majority, we have a C3, a C4, and a PAC, and we're an independent political organization building power that centers Black and Brown communities towards racial equity, gender justice, climate action. And we're energizing a new majority electorate to really bring a new Florida into being. And we believe in unleashing the talent of people of color, of women of color across the state, and that will drive the transformational change that we need so that all of our families can thrive. Our top priorities are the Voter Rights Restoration Ballot Initiative, Amendment 4. Last year, in deep partnership with the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition and the leadership of directly impacted folks, and a coalition of organizations across the state in this statewide alignment group, we collected over 1 million signatures to put voter rights restoration on the ballot. And this year we're committed to knocking on doors and talking to people and making sure that we win in November, and so that people with a felony conviction who have been systematically disenfranchised as a legacy of Jim Crow are able to fully participate in democracy. I think the other kind of big area of work that New FM has really been leading into is climate action, and really looking at, here in Florida, we're ground zero for a lot of the impacts of climate change on the United States. And we know that communities of color and poor communities are going to be hit worst. And so really making sure that we're kind of engaging folks in developing the bold solutions that we need to protect our families. We know that we need to build long-term power to gain governance, right? At the city level, at the county level, at the state level, and ultimately to transform the country.
You can't go in assuming that you're going to change the world overnight, because a lot of these communities are dealing with long-term crisis, long-term systemic racism and issues related to that that have been compounded year after year, election after election, candidate after candidate, many of whom have, once they won, turned their back on these communities. So to be aware of that as an organizer and as an organization, part of what we're always thinking about is how do we not only get these small victories, but maintain a level of accountability for the folks that we elect, and through this kind of long-term notion of civic engagement and empowerment, getting people to understand that they do possess the power to be the ultimate change agent, but they have to do it in a continuum, right? It's bigger than just their casting a vote. It's bigger than just their even becoming a member or a leader within the organization. It is a constant sort of maintenance and demand on people and on systems to make things better.
Part of the work is developing a long-term vision, ideology, and plan to progressive governance at the city, county, and state level. And then, what are the campaigns that get us there, and the kind of rigorous practice and assessment that we need to be doing together. So the statewide alignment group is a collaboration between New Florida Majority, Dream Defenders, the Florida Immigrant Coalition, SCIU, Faith in Florida, Organize Florida, and Central Florida Jobs with Justice. And this is a collaboration to break the back of Jim Crow and attain non-patriarchal governance that will transform Florida and the nation. And well, I mean, I think the the kind of changes that we're determined to make really requires shifting who holds power and resources in our movements. And it really necessitates like fostering collaboration in the field that builds trust and erodes some of the obstacles to long-term shared visioning, planning, division of labor, and creates like the real space for us to be honest about where we are, where we need to go, and what it's going to take for us to get there. And I think here in Florida, we were seeing election cycle after election cycle, year after year, millions of dollars getting poured into the state and nothing left behind. It all kind of dissipating and disappearing after election day, in spite of like organizations being committed to be in communities like year round. And in a state like Florida, really a deep recognition that none of us are going to be able to do it alone. And so what does it look like to get a set of organizations that are committed to racial justice and long-term and a long-term commitment to Florida to come together to break the back of Jim Crow and develop a 10-year plan to non-patriarchal governing power. And you know, and that commitment that like we're not going to disappear the day after election day, like we'll be deep in communities like 2 weeks after, the year after, and the year after that, and disrupting, you know, a lot of people's disengagement in electoral politics is because it's become so transactional, and people can see right through that. Like, you know, people want to be like respected and heard, and not just like used by a politician or by an organization in the service of a particular political party.
What SWAG centers on are these population centers, right? And recognizing that true political power can only be achieved if you're really building a coalition between these major swaths of community, not only just in terms of racial and ethnic makeup, but spending power. You know, the ability for those dollars to mobilize. All of us, you know, as collective organizations, are also trying to build our membership bases as a result, right? Because we want those folks in those communities to see what collective power looks like and know that if I'm in Orlando, that I can trust that the folks doing the work down in Miami, or the folks doing the work up in Jacksonville, or the folks doing the work in Tampa are all on the same page, and that we're trying to move the state forward and move our issues forward responsibly. That it all can't be done in one space, right? I think what all of us individually kind of learned is that we were doing our work in these pockets, but until Miami, Orlando, Tampa, Jacksonville, Palm Beach, Fort Lauderdale are all on the same page, we're kind of going to be stuck in the mud, spinning our wheels. And so that's why the SWAG group and the collective is so important.
There wasn't a baseline. I mean, I guess I could say there just wasn't enough trust, and there wasn't a commitment to a long-term, there wasn't a shared ideology, a shared analysis, or a long-term vision of where we needed to go. And so for the first, and that showed up in like different ways. I mean, I think that we see it, it shows up, it comes out in movement places all the time, where like there are political differences or interpersonal dynamics that that don't get like worked out, and people don't bring their political disagreements forward. Organizations undermine each other, and it, you know, at the end of the day, doesn't serve the work. And really, like the first 2 years of us creating a statewide alignment group were about trust building. It was about like really getting to know the leaders of different, you know, the different organizations that were doing work in multiple geographies across the state, and starting a process of talking about like, where are we trying to go? Like, what's the 10-year vision? What's, you know, really spending a lot of time on developing a shared ideology. How do we understand the right? what is our ideology for what we're trying to move towards, and then what are the campaigns that we think are going to get us there. And listen, like, we're still gonna, I mean, I think we're all aware that we're still gonna have political disagreements, we're still gonna have tactical differences, but our commitment to each other is to show up in a different way.
In various iterations, all these organizations tried to market themselves, and we're guilty of it too, as statewide organizations, right? Mm-hmm. Without really having the capacity to operate statewide. Mm-hmm. And of course, trying to get those resources and making the promises that we could operate statewide is irresponsible when you're trying to do deep movement building, right? Because for New FM to move into a county that's unfamiliar territory to us, that another organization is operating in and has been operating in for years, there's a recognition that that's irresponsible, that you have to give credit to those who've been doing the work in that space prior to, and that those who may have access to resources, whether that's labor, whether that's foundations or whomever, have to be willing to concede that although they have money that can be placed there, it's the responsibility of those who've been doing the work to guide where that money is best going to be best used and best resourced. Mm-hmm. And kind of holding hands and taking leaps of faith when all those conversations kind of fold, and recognizing that, hey, the only way we're going to be able to grow is if we grow together. If we keep doing the same thing, as we talk about definition of insanity and expecting a different result, then we're going to ultimately all go crazy, right?
So how do you create a group that's small enough that you can build deep trust, with some sort of criteria? So for us, that was about organizations doing work in multiple counties, committed to the state long term and centering a racial justice analysis. But I think we partner with organizations within counties, or convene kind of local statewide alignment group partners, or partner with organizations on specific strands of work. So at Florida Rights Restoration Coalition on Amendment 4, the Miami Workers Center on the Femme Agenda, just kind of really thinking through what's the constellation of organizations that you need to build a long-term plan and vision, and then what does partnership with other parts of the ecosystem look like?
When Hurricane Irma hit Florida, right, and it went through a large swath of the entire state, right? So it impacted South, Middle, North, you name it. And I say that was a shining moment for SWAG in its simplicity, was the ability to communicate through our partnership that where government is failing, we're going to ultimately have to step up and step in, right? In the most basic of ways. And what I mean by that is just getting a series of grills and charcoal and hot dogs and hamburgers, and literally going out and feeding entire segments of the community. I think we ended up ultimately feeding several thousand.
Like 10, 20,000.
Yeah, several thousand families statewide. And, that kind of in a nutshell summed up to me what the greatest potential of SWAG could be, which is a resource for people who are oftentimes left out of the conversation. Because the follow-up conversation, at least in Miami-Dade, was that government was applauding itself and patting itself on the back for doing a great job, when in reality we were seeing people who were literally boxed out, and thought that they were going to be forgotten. People who literally thought they were going to die, in that 1 to 2 week period, while at the same time seeing the contrast of folks who are in these positions with millions and billions of dollars of resources, making it seem as though everything was just hunky-dory, is a constant reminder of A, the challenges that we face, B, the work that we have to do as an organization, but C, and I think, as I mentioned before, what our greatest successes could be if everything works responsibly, right? It's almost felt like you had two cans with strings attached, with a string attached in the middle, one spanning from Miami to Jacksonville, because we kind of felt that level of being cut off. It felt that real, but at the same time, we were able to communicate through whatever means to get that word out and get that mobilization effort happening in 24, 48 hours after a storm, which is remarkable considering we're not first responders. We're not highly trained technicians. We're just folks concerned about the communities that we live in.
Well, and I think the storm is also a real example of how do we engage in short-term or immediate fights that help advance our longer-term vision and make some material gains. I mean, we ended up suing the USDA and Department of Children and Families on their failure to provide accommodation to people with disabilities and seniors for emergency food stamp benefits. They had people waiting in the hot sun for over 8 hours. And we got over $4 million in additional food stamp benefits to families in Florida. Absolutely. And we're able to set some important historic precedents, removing obstacles from an emergency SNAP in the future.
The weak nature of the Florida Democratic Party should lend itself to more of a movement shakeup. The problem is that we are operating in the Jim Crow South. So people now still have a sense of reluctance that we still have to take these incremental steps towards success. And it scares me as a Floridian because when you look at the movement behind Stacey Abrams in Georgia, this was a 2 to 3 year process in which here's a person who stakes their claim. Their last attempt was Jimmy Carter's grandson, right? That's who they ran for governor. Was that kind of last ditch, let's try to find a name attached to the establishment and run them in hopes of restoring the Democratic prominence of Georgia, and they failed. So what does the Democratic establishment in Georgia say? Well, if that's didn't work, let's try something radically different. Let's take somebody who's the head of our Democratic caucus in the House, who's shown natural leadership, and put her in a position to now be governor of the state of Georgia. Now, of course, there's pushback. There's still establishment candidates, but there's still a momentum around that. Fast forward to Florida, and if I were to give you just resumes A, B, and C, A, B, C, and D of the 4 Democratic candidates, without putting a color or name attached to them, from a pure who's the better person to run based on aptitude, qualifications, time in office, progressive gravitas, connections, Rolodex, the whole 9 yards, it would be one person, and that would be Mayor Gillum, right? But because of his age, because of his race, and because we are in the Jim Crow South, there is still this overarching reluctance for fundamental change, that he's too progressive or he's running on too left of a thing. He's saying crazy things like we should restore the rights of 1.5 million people who've served their time. He's saying these wild things like we should have expanded Medicaid and covered the 800,000 people who fall victim to what we call the donut hole in Florida, where they can't, they're too poor, too rich for Medicaid, but too poor to afford what's out there in the insurance universe. It's a problem. it's a problem that we're ultimately trying to figure out how do we best correct that from an organizational standpoint through SWAG, through New FM, and through our desire to want to see fundamental change here in the state of Florida, because we understand if we could shift Florida, when you look at the top 4 states in terms of population, California, Florida, Texas, and New York, 2 out of those 4 have at least strong progressive ties and the ability for organizations like ours to kind of move the politics in those states. There's been a responsiveness from grassroots organizations like New Florida Majority, like what we're trying to do with SWAG. But nationally, when you think about New Virginia Majority, when you think about the Ohio Organizing Collaborative and Step Up Louisiana and some of these other very, very grassroots-centered organizations that are out here trying to be responsive to the needs of the community, but then also translate that to these national parties and organizations. And 2016 was kind of, in my opinion, the tipping point, right? We've kind of gone along to get along. We've convinced you for decades that if you vote for our person, that at least we're better than the alternative. And people are now saying that we don't want better than the alternative. We want actual responsiveness. We want you running on a platform that speaks to helping the larger community. And so when you look at some of the wins in the last year and a half since the 2016 election, whether it's Woodfin in Birmingham, Alabama, or Lumumba in Jackson, Mississippi, or even looking at the Doug Jones election for the U.S. Senate, that was a grassroots movement. The Democratic Party, of course, wants to take credit for that. But we're talking about a large-scale mass mobilization of local community folks who said enough is enough, who said, all right, we're going to make sure that we mobilize Black women more than we've done in the past. We're going to make sure that we get an overperformance from this community has been left out of Alabama electoral politics in the age of Jim Crow, right? And we're going to overperform. And it was odd to see the Democratic Party try to take credit for a guy like Doug Jones outperforming President Obama.
We're not going to get where we need to go with who we've got. We have to have outward facing movements, organizations that are building power and getting us to the kind of scale that we need to enact the kind of changes that we're talking about. And in terms of organizational form, I think we're experimenting with that. In addition to the statewide alignment group, we are experimenting with owning the means of political production and starting up. We just started up an LLC, there has been an LLC started up in Florida that will be generating resources for the movement, but is also kind of to disrupt the consultant industrial complex and the way that political dollars get spent in any given election cycle. We hold strong critiques of any elected official that isn't rising to the occasion and meeting the needs of our communities. And at the same time, there are champions that they may be a champion on one issue, but not on another. So I think we understand the difference between tactical and strategic allies, and having critiques of the Democratic Party doesn't preclude having deep relationships with people inside the Democratic Party and our need to fundamentally, the broader we need to fundamentally transform it. And I know, Dwight, you can definitely kind of speak to this as someone who was one of our progressive champions in the state legislature. And, New FM, RC4 does endorse candidates. And And then, we believe it's part of our mission to hold candidates accountable, get candidates into and out of office, and that's part of the exercise of governance.
As a DNC member, I feel no say-so in the machinations of the party, right? So it's like they'll make a arbitrary rule, someone, the chair, kind of a small group of people will collaborate, come up with some sort of thing, and then every quarter they'll call guys and men and women like myself up and say, all right, let's vote on something we've pre-established. And that, in a nutshell, is why we're failing, right?
I mean, I would say, like, yes, those critiques are valid, and like when you live in the South or when you live in a state that's controlled by the right, there are very real impacts on the lives of the people in the communities that we care about. And if you're not, in the state of Florida, we do not have a Department of Labor. We do not have, because the right just did away with it. They just didn't think that it was necessary to have a place where, if you're not paid, that you can go to, that there would be any recourse. So for us, when the federal government was the only place that we, if the federal government did not have a minimum wage of $7.25 an hour, we probably would not have a minimum wage at all in the state of Florida right now. So, when you have someone like Donald Trump and the right controlling the federal governing apparatus, plus the right controlling the state, and in many times the county and the city, for us, our political context is so different that, and we had this conversation with our friends in Mississippi and in other parts of the South. While yes, we want like bold progressive candidates and champions, and we will recruit those and we will ride for those, we also just need to break, the right's like strongholds on some really basic, policies that, Democrats have advanced. Like while they haven't been able to, really lean into a lot of the bold changes that we'd like to see, there are a set of policies that our people like need and deserve. We can't understate like the role of corporate Democrats and who controls the Democratic Party establishment currently. And the people's response to like the historic threat of Trumpism has been powerful and may bring victories in the coming elections, but we have to be honest about the fact that we're far less prepared to defeat the far right and undo the extensive damage that it's done at all levels of our country. And without strong, power-building, state-based, national and state united fronts committed to social justice, then we'll just, continue to have corporate like neoliberalism, even if Democrats can gain control. And essentially, like that is our task. Like that's on us. Is how do we elect? Like yes, take back the White House, but don't take or that's not even the right term. I don't want to use that. How do we win the White House and not have a neoliberal corporate Democrat in office? Like what does it actually take for us to defeat Trumpism and make like really bold progressive gains, as Dwight outlined, in terms of like that change can happen incredibly quickly if we look at the history of the Tea Party, but it requires like a significant amount of work and rigor for us to get there.
And I would say without organizations like ours or organizations at the grassroots level organizing and trying to make the case for that, I honestly believe that the Democratic political establishment would convince themselves that if they just wore blue versions of the Make America Great Again hats and perverted the same message, that everything would be all right with the world, right? And that's dangerous. The idea that someone, for the purpose of quote unquote winning, would make that move, but there's someone who's probably getting a consulting fee who's really thinking that if you just flip that and try to court those Trump voters and get them just to return back with the promise that you won't, reform the prison system, or that you won't acknowledge that DACA recipients deserve to be in this country, that everything will be in proper order. And that's why organizations like ours and other grassroots organizations are so critically important to changing that dynamic. I think those efforts are critically important. I never think it's an either or. I think the addition and the presence of DSA, Our Revolution, DFA, especially some of those folks that are really spending a lot of time developing candidates and doing candidate recruitment, not necessarily exclusively, but making it a important part of their initiative, is helpful to organizations like ours, because we're organizing around key issues, and what we're finding is that candidates are now coming in to want to talk to us about what are the issues that we need to be talking about. Like, that's in our minds, in our collective kind of thought process, that's ultimately what we want to do, is kind of move these folks to be more deliberate about talking about issues around racism, sexism, discrimination. The ability, the idea that we can have, a statewide candidate who's running for attorney general sit around at our table and just pick our brains and kind of see where we agree. The idea that, we can do a conversation with our existing state senator, our existing U.S. senator, to talk about what he needs to do to look bolder and be bolder. Whether he listens or not kind of shows a level of progress in terms of the work that we do. But to going back to your point about those organizations, for them to recognize that, okay, this person's not working, so let's move and shift someone else and put them into the equation. We have, right now we're looking at a slate of 2018 folks that are coming from the Women's March that are running. We have someone running here for County Commission whose direct involvement comes via the Women's March as to why it is that she wants to run. That is done work in coalition spaces around immigrant rights. And that's what ultimately inspired her to want to do it, right? And so I'm here for it.
Anything you want to add on that question, Andrea?
No, I mean, all of it. And we're all going to play different roles. But, at the end of the day, we need to figure out how to develop and implement coordinated strategies to defeat the current racist and fascist and hetero-patriarchal movement that's captured all three branches of government and a majority of states, and build independent, progressive governing power that can push forward a social, economic, and racial justice agenda. I mean, that's the work